Blue Trails Guide webinar. My name is Faye Augustin, and I'm a Conservation Director with American Rivers. I really appreciate all of you taking the time to participate in our webinar this month, Protecting Wild Rivers Through Public Lands Planning. A couple of quick things before we get started with the presentation this morning or afternoon. As a reminder, if your connection is lost, please go ahead and log in again using your unique web link and passcode that was provided when you registered with GoToWebinar. And as always, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on July 18th for viewing at bluetrailsguide.org/blog. We'll also share the link to this webinar with all of the participants after the webinar is recorded as well. And then if you have any follow-up questions or concerns during the webinar or after, please feel free to reach out. My contact information is on the screen below. And then we encourage, as always with our webinars, lots of questions and answers. You have a question box on the side panel of your GoToWebinar box. So please, throughout the webinar, as Mike is sharing his information, ask questions as we're moving forward. But as always, we'll leave about 5 minutes at the end of the webinar to answer as many of those questions as we can. And if you want to wait until the end to go ahead and ask your question, you're welcome to do that as well. And we will share a transcript of questions and answers that were not asked, that did not get answered during the webinar, once we're completed. So at this point, I want to welcome my colleague, Mike Fiebig, who is our Northern Rockies Conservation Director, to our July Blue Trails Guide webinar. Mike works with local citizens, recreationists, businesses, elected officials, and agencies to protect free-flowing rivers in the Northern Rockies. This work takes many forms, including public lands policy, grassroots advocacy, strategic partnerships, collaborative processes, and connecting people to rivers through storytelling and engagement. Mike joined American Rivers in 2011, and prior to that, he was a presidential management fellow with the U.S. Forest Service working on climate change mitigation. As an avid paddler and lifelong river guide and senior instructor at Knowles, Mike has paddled over 14,000 miles of rivers in the West. Mike received his Master's of Science in Natural Resource Policy and Conflict Resolution from University of Montana, and he has a Bachelor's of Science in Neuroscience and Philosophy from Michigan State University. So without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce my colleague, Mike Fiebig with American Rivers.
Thanks, Faye, and welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in to what can be a policy wonkish topic, but I'm going to try to demystify it. And for those who have a lot of policy knowledge around wild and scenic rivers, there's going to be some review at the beginning that I'm going to try to move through fairly quickly. But for those that are new, don't worry, we're going to start at the beginning. So why wild and scenic rivers and why wild rivers protection? So some of you probably know that this year is the 50th anniversary of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, the most powerful form of river protection in our country, and you know, a beacon of hope to river conservationists worldwide as well. It keeps rivers free flowing, and I'll go through exactly what it does in a moment. But what I'm going to talk about today is not the piece that is the federal designation, you know, that has to go through both bodies of Congress and be signed by the president, but the piece that is the agency administrative part. So a lot like wilderness inventories or inventoried roadless areas, when agencies renew their resource management plan, they have to inventory wild and scenic eligible rivers and then protect them administratively. So I'm going to talk about that process and how you can engage in it after a little bit of background info. So the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act does three major things. It keeps rivers free flowing. So it prevents large dams, diversions that would impact their free flowing character. And a lot of dams look like this these days. They're, you know, run of the river hydro projects that are proposed up in headwaters reaches. They're not the big dams of yesteryear. They're more of these small projects that still impact fish passage, impact the ecological values and ecosystem services of a river and impact recreation. A lot of times a little dam like this will put most of a stream's flow into a penstock. That penstock flows downriver for 3 to 10 miles and then creates electricity on its way out after coming back in below the dewatered reach. So it also maintains or enhances water quality from the time of designation. And then the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act protects a suite of outstandingly remarkable values that are unique to each river. And we'll go through some of these. I guess we'll go through them later on. So this is a little bit more background context. We have over 90,000 dams in the United States, according to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. That is compared with, just 208 wild and scenic segments. Those 90,000 dams impact over 600,000 miles of river, compared to just over 12,000 miles of river are protected as free-flowing in perpetuity. So the idea behind the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act 50 years ago was to create a balance between rivers that are dammed and diverted for human utility and those that are kept free-flowing. And clearly the balance has not yet quite been met. So one of the ways we can help with that balance is by engaging in public lands management planning for wild and scenic eligibility inventories. We do this a lot in the Northern Rockies. And actually across the Western United States and even in the East, a number of forests and BLM planning areas are going through resource management plan or forest plan revisions right now. By just a little bit of engagement on behalf of your orgs or as a private citizen, you can help to identify and protect these wild and scenic eligible streams. And since most resource management plans or forest plans only are revised every 20 years or so, this is a once in a generation opportunity realistically. And it's underscored by the fact that a wild and scenic designation is so hard to get through Congress. If we can engage with these revisions and protect some rivers, it's really worth our while. So the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act in Section 5 is where this language is laid out, requiring the secretaries to study potential additions to the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And then in the 2012 planning rule, the Forest Service also points out that each forest must identify the eligible rivers that they have on their forest during resource management plan revision. The agency basically looks at, and then as we're diving down from law to planning rule to now Forest Service and BLM manuals, these are the interpretations that the agencies publish each year. This is what the agencies look at as their process. So inventory eligible rivers, and that's all streams that are free flowing and have at least one outstandingly remarkable value. On a 7.5-minute topo map, they'll look at every named stream since the 2012 planning rule, and that was an agency initiative. And then they'll classify those as wild, scenic, or recreational. We'll talk about what all those means. And then potentially they'll determine suitability or not. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too. They can defer suitability. So in forest planning, basically, for those who are new to forest planning, this is a basic rundown of what forest planning looks like these days. And they're typically 4 to 5 year processes that include a pre-assessment period, an assessment and scoping, a proposed action from the agency, and then a draft environmental impact statement, final environmental impact statement, and record of decision. It's on the left side of your screen. I won't go into that in too much detail, but the parallel process for wild and scenic eligibility and potential suitability is on the right. So the agency will create a list or publish a list of streams for their inventory, you know, all of these named streams on a 3.5-minute topo. They'll publish an evaluation process and set of criteria. You can comment on all of these during the process. And then they'll work through a draft eligibility evaluation with comments, a final eligibility evaluation with comments, and then eventually after the record of decision or before the record of decision, they'll identify management direction for those segments too. So the public is able to intervene and weigh in on all of those processes, both from the list, you know, the agency doesn't just have to identify the named reaches in a 3.5-minute topographic map. If local knowledge or indigenous knowledge has a different name or a different stream or a smaller stream, weighing in will trigger change conditions, and the agency will evaluate that stream too. So it's really important to weigh in. A lot of times what we find is the difference between when the agency first publishes their intent to do an eligibility evaluation and their list of streams and their process to the final, partners weighing in can almost double the amount of rivers and river miles that are protected ultimately in the end. And that's not because there's a bias toward advocacy, it's because or any sort of, you know, piece like that. It's because the forest oftentimes doesn't know exactly what is on the land they manage and what some of those values are. And that's because they're looking at thousands of streams potentially. So local knowledge is key. So eligible streams have to be free-flowing and possess at least one or more outstandingly remarkable values, or ORVs. Region of comparisons for that can vary from being forest-wide to regional or even national in scope. Most times the agency will have a different region of comparison for different outstandingly remarkable values. It's kind of a cumbersome term, but that's the term that Congress used. We call them ORVs for short, and not to be confused with off-road vehicles. And oftentimes I end up arguing about the proper region of comparison. So for instance, if you have a stream that is, you know, rare, unique, or exemplary in its scenery locally, it may be even more so nationally. It just depends on what you're comparing it to. So ORVs must meet at least one of the following criteria. It's got to be within the river corridor, the river or its corridor, or, not and, or contribute substantially to the functioning of the river, or be river dependent and owe its location or existence to the presence of the river. So in layman's terms, it has to either be part of the river currently or have been caused by the river in the past, or be a piece that contributes significantly to the functioning of the river. Here's some different ORVs we can have, as named by Congress. These are our potential outstanding remarkable values. We have scenery, recreation, and recreation of all sorts. That could be swimming, kayaking, birding, hiking, spelunking if it's a hydrologically dependent cave system, so forth. Fisheries, wildlife, botany, geology, history, and that would be the history of Lewis and Clark on that one, the Wild and Scenic Missouri breaks. Cultural, indigenous. And then Congress says, or any other similar value. This is the Concord River, and the Concord River actually has a literary value attached to it. But there are a number of other values that people are changing or are adding these days, things like climate refugia for native fish and so forth, which some people put that under a fisheries ORV, some people put it as a separate one. So wild and scenic rivers can be very diverse. They can be high altitude wetlands like this. They can be ephemeral, intermittent, or underground even, so there's no minimum flow. They don't have to be navigable. They can have significant waterfalls or drops in them. There's no minimum size or length. You can have a very short river, and you can have one that doesn't flow year-round or is just a trickle. And then the classification system. So this gets some confusion, or causes some confusion. So under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, there are 3 different classes of river. They're called wild, scenic, and recreational. They all have the same protections generally. Wild rivers also get an additional mineral withdrawal, but they should probably better be called undeveloped, partially developed, and developed. And when an agency identifies a classification after a river is designated wild and scenic, it can't let it slip from one designation to another. So for instance, it can't allow the building on public land of something that would allow a river to go from wild to recreational or scenic. So this is an example of a wild river. It's roadless, has some only accessible by trail or by boat or plane. It's a vestige of primitive America. Example of a scenic river. It could have a road coming in and out of it. It might have some campgrounds developed along it, but it's generally partially developed or lightly developed. It doesn't have buildings. It's mostly dominated by natural landforms and so forth. And then a recreational river covers basically everything else that can be fully developed rivers. And as you might have noticed, for those who might have recognized some of these rivers, these aren't designated rivers. They're just pictures that illustrate the development level. So recreational rivers could actually run through a downtown, and they do in some areas, but they can have all manner of developments. So that's eligibility, brief introduction. Wild and Scenic suitability processes take this one step further, and they look at the political context surrounding the river. They look at economics and so forth. Wild and Scenic eligibility is, for the most part, a fairly objective process. There's some objectivity on what's outstandingly remarkable, but if it's free-flowing and has at least one ORV, it's eligible. Suitability asks the agency to identify the best and highest use of a river. And so suitability processes are somewhat controversial. They're first identified in the law as congressional study rivers. So Congress can say, hey, we don't really want to designate River X, but we'd like the agency to study it. And so what the agency does then over the course of 3 years is study its context and whether it recommends it for designation or not. And it comes out with a suitability report when it's done. More recently, agencies have started doing suitability in planning. The agencies, BLM and Forest Service, hold that they can do or defer suitability anytime they'd like. Some folks on the conservation side aren't exactly sure. More on that later. This is an example of why folks on the conservation side are worried about suitability. This is from the Idaho County Commissioners last year. We believe that the suitability process would eliminate most of these eligible rivers, thus eliminating unnecessary and burdensome regulations on land. So there's a lot of pressure out there to go through suitability and release administratively protected eligible rivers. This is from the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest. And you can see where suitability lies in there, and that inverted pyramid is basically the number of streams being funneled down to final management, and suitability is a significant sieve to do that. Check this out on their story map. You Google them. Eligible streams, though, receive interim protections in Section 84, and that's why we want to keep them as eligible and not have them released during suitability. a great way to protect them administratively. It's not as powerful as a designation, but it's still powerful. It constrains agency and federal actions that would either compromise free flow ORVs or water quality. Citizen engagement is key, and I'm running low on time, so I'll fly through these. As you can imagine, something we do a lot, and we do with our coalitions, is put out a really basic list of streams that we think should be wild and scenic eligible and what their potential ORVs are, their potential values. Then we submit those to the agencies. Most importantly, though, are building relationships with your local agency officials through meetings, both formal meetings, and you can set up a time to go sit down with the interdisciplinary team that's doing a plan revision and actually tell them what you care about regarding rivers, or present your eligibility inventory if you do want to make one yourself. The most important thing, though, is to engage. Don't be dissuaded by the wonkiness or feeling like you have to put together a whole eligibility report. If you have a couple streams or a few streams, or you just want to advocate for a system of streams on your public lands, please get out there and do it. A simple email or phone call is really the start, and it's really worthwhile. Nantahala, Pisgah on the east. In the east is a great example of a really good collaborative partnership, and we have a few of these going on. And Wild and Scenic recommendations are part of what this partnership is working toward. And it's a diverse group of stakeholders, everything from paddlers and anglers, but also, timber industry, tourism, recreation folks, mountain bikers, hikers, ag, ranching. And this is an example of recommendations that they did. So they've got on the far left the currently eligible streams from the last forest plan revision, the additional draft streams that the Forest Service did, and then on the far right is the partnership's recommendations for streams that go over and above that. And I wouldn't be surprised if they get some of those through their process. A great way to stay informed is to look up your local forest or BLM planning area, and then on the right there you see that thing that says get involved. Click that and then enter your email address, and then you'll be notified for all of the comment periods, all of the public meetings, and so forth. It's a great way to not have to remember all those things on their own. The agency will prompt you. Sometimes you've got to dig around for that button or the place to enter your email address. It's typically under planning, but if you Google forest plan revision for, say, Nantahala Pisgah National Forest, or resource management plan revision for the Challis planning area, you'll eventually get to a screen where you can sign up for updates. So current planning efforts, I'll fly through these. We've done a number, I'm just going to go right through these up in the Northern Rockies. They're all going really well. I won't dig into them. One that's ongoing is this one. The Salmon Challis National Forest in Central Idaho is right in the process of finalizing their eligibility inventory. They have a draft out right now that looks really good. They've identified 69 rivers as potentially eligible. And if you love that area, and if you've ever been down any of the salmon forks, they really need to hear from you that that wild rivers are important. They've heard a lot of pushback from folks that don't want to see eligible streams protected. And starting later this month, they'll actually dive into a suitability process where one of their stated goals is to weed out some of these eligible rivers. So there's their email up there. Jot it down. SCNF plan_rev@fs.fed.us, and shoot them a note that says you support wild and scenic rivers. Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest, a little farther north in a different forest region, is also planning to go through a suitability process, and they'll need to hear from you too. Current forest planning processes, again, I'll go through these quickly. if you want to scroll down there and find your state that you're looking at, these are all on the docket within the next 3 or 4 years. So some of them are actually in process or getting close to finished. So please dig in, look for them. They need your engagement, whatever you can give. These are ones, I guess those were all the ones in process. These are the ones coming up soon. So again, if you want to find your state, jot them down. This webinar will also be recorded, and my contact info is coming up. So if you need some more information, if this is going too quickly, let me know. BLM planning. Here's what's coming up right now. You want to take a look at your state. There are quite a few of them. When you start to see these all on a list, it underscores the magnitude of the opportunity we have to advocate for wild rivers. I mean, this is literally thousands of miles of stream and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of acres of riverside lands that could potentially be protected as wild and scenic eligible on BLM and forest lands. And then we're to the questions part, and I'll just go straight to my contact info. So please feel free to jot it down and get in touch with me afterwards.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike, for that really great overview of how to engage in protecting wild rivers through resource management plan revisions. I know I found it really helpful. So as a reminder, we've got a couple minutes for questions and answers. So if you have not yet jotted your question down in the question box, please feel free to go ahead and do that now. But I'll get started with the couple that are in there. So Mike, can you just briefly describe again the difference between suitability and eligibility?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I had to fly through that and it gets pretty dense. So eligibility inventories are required by the law and under the planning rule to take place for all federal, well, for BLM and Forest Service land management agencies. And eligibility inventories are looked at as more of an objective cut. If a stream, either through citizen advocacy or through Forest Service analyses, is both free-flowing and has at least one outstanding value, so that's rare, unique, or exemplary within a region of comparison, I know this gets wonky, then it has to be found eligible and it has to be protected for the life of the forest plan. So it's somewhat objective, though I typically debate with agencies and work with agencies on both region of comparison and what value is outstandingly remarkable. We typically agree on whether it's free-flowing or not. Suitability is a process that the agencies look at as being optional, and some of the conservation community looks at as not being allowed during planning processes. But basically, a suitability determination looks at the socio-political, economic, and kind of best use climate of a river, and the agency decides whether that river should be recommended as wild and scenic to Congress. The flip side of that is if it's not recommended, so say they do a suitability determination on 69 streams that they've identified on the Salmon Challis National Forest, and decide that only 10 of them should be recommended to Congress, the other 59 get released back to multiple use management. So from a conservation standpoint, there's very little upside and a whole lot of downside to suitability determinations. And there's debate on whether that was the original intent of the law. This is kind of an ongoing debate that just started a couple years ago. And hopefully we'll get some resolution on whether that was the intention under the Act and in the planning rule or not, to be able to do these in forest planning processes. The place that suitability determinations are allowed, and everyone agrees that they are allowed, is on congressional study rivers. So Congress, instead of designating a river, can say, hey, that looks awesome. We're not quite ready to do that yet, though. We want some more information. So Bureau of Land Management, go study this thing and provide us with your recommendation in the form of a suitability report. Where is it with economics? Is it controversial? Are there better ways to protect it? Are there resource extraction plans for it that would better serve the needs of the country, so forth?
That's really helpful, Mike. And then one follow-up to that question, and this might be our last question at this point, just looking at time, is do you need a suitability in order to be officially designated, or can you just go from eligibility to designation?
That's a great question. Congress can, as you all know, Congress can do whatever it wants. So we actually have rivers that have been designated as wild and scenic that haven't even been found to be eligible. It's kind of a separate and political process to get a river designated. It usually takes upwards of 10 years right now to designate a single stream or a series of streams in an advocacy campaign. So the answer is no, it doesn't have to. It is nice to have a river found eligible before it's put in front of Congress, because oftentimes during Natural Resource Committee and subcommittee hearings, senators or congressmen will ask, well, where does the agency stand on this? And it's really nice to be able to say, the agency fully stands behind this. They found it to be eligible and to have these outstanding values. So it does help in that respect. As far as we can tell, there doesn't seem to be any added benefit to being able to say it's suitable versus being able to say it's eligible. And of course, we have the added risk of having a number of rivers released through a suitability determination.
That's great. Thank you so much, Mike. There were a couple of questions that were not answered during the question session, so I will work with Mike to get those answered and then have those answers included in the email that we send out to folks with the recording. So thank you all again for your participation in our July webinar. And Mike, thank you so much for your really helpful and detailed explanation of how we as organizations and citizens can engage in the protection of wild rivers through forest and resource management plans. I encourage you all to join us in September as we come back for our next Blue Trails Guide webinar. So stay tuned for that information. And Mike, thank you again for such a great presentation, and for all of you for your participation. Have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thank you, Faye, and everyone.